vores tredje session på årets Future TV Konference. Jeg ser lige på dansk, inden vi introducerer Steve her, at det næste, vi skal se her, er noget af det, jeg med stor fascination har fulgt de sidste års tid. Altså et firma, der simpelthen har specialiseret sig i at lave nogle helt nye målemetoder for popularitet ude på nettet. Og det giver et meget fint indtryk af, hvad er det, der skal til, før vi kan vokse. Så I får endnu en gang en masse data, og så næste session med Nikolaj Sønder, der bliver endnu mere datainformation. Og så går vi lidt ned i gear, og vi skal til at reflektere over alle de her ting, der dog sker på det her marked. Men Steve, are you there? Welcome.
I am here, Klaus. Good morning.
And you are sitting in Sydney, and this is a fantastic thing that we have learned during the corona crisis, that we can have a really interesting presentation. We can find the right guy, and he doesn't need to go to Copenhagen. So you are, of course, welcome in Copenhagen sometime, but it's really nice to have you here online on a fine, smooth connection from Sydney, Australia.
Thank you. Yes, they won't let me out of the country, so I thought I'd come to you instead.
Very good. This morning we have had free presentations with a lot of data, a lot of information about the streaming market. And one thing I noticed here was that on the Nordic market alone, I think the total number of hours was 150,000 hours of different content available to Nordic viewers on streaming and television services. So what on earth are people actually watching out there, and what is the criteria for success for what kind of content you should produce in the future? So as I just said, I have been really fascinated following Parrot Analytics and the way that you have kind of invented a new way of measuring audience demand on not just a global market, but also on our market. And for today's presentation, you have some really interesting, very fresh data about Nordic demand for content. So, Steve, I guess that you could just briefly introduce yourself and the company, and if everything runs smoothly, you are now sitting there on your desk in Sydney and should be able to change your PowerPoint. Could we have the next image where we see the PowerPoint from Steve? Okay, so, perfect, yes. So to say, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Klaus. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak at Future TV. I'd like to thank Klaus and all the organisers for their passion and their wonderful preparation, and all the sponsors of this amazing event. Thank you to everyone joining today. I sincerely hope that this finds you and your families safe and well. I'm Steve Langdon. I'm the Regional Director for Parrot Analytics, and I'm speaking to you from that very well-known part of the Nordics called Sydney, where I cannot leave the country to join you, but no matter, I'm coming to you directly from my Sydney desk. It's always interesting having an analyst section of a program, as each one tells a slightly different story. That's what analysts do. You'll be taking deep dives into the region's supply of content, including subscriber and revenue information. So I thought I'd take a different view and show you a story of an empirical view of how Nordic content is being demanded by consumers. Because after all, consumer demand is the flywheel that drives the industry we all love and are within. Now this year, the top 5 media companies will invest almost $98 billion in content. But locally, we demand much more than that. We demand our cultural stories, our diversity, our contrasts on our screens. And how do we understand the mixture for international success? So the battle we all fight is a battle for consumers' attention. So isn't it better to fight that battle armed with data? Well, we believe it is. Let me just see if my slide clicker works. It doesn't seem to be. Hang on one second. Christoph, would you manually put the slide forward? Thank you very much indeed. It's not working. Okay, so what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at how we uncover total available audiences, to give you a very quick introduction. Then we're going to have a look at the opportunity for Nordic content that manages to travel around the world. Then we're going to look at what contributes to and defines a hit, what makes a hit go global. Then we're going to look at a very key piece of work we're doing here, that how do you assess the title's value to a service or a platform in this day and age when, you know, it's very difficult to understand success criteria. Then the latest research on audience demand for binge versus weekly drop, which is a hot topic. And then we'll look at what we've learned today. Next slide, please. So what is demand? Well, let me give you a quick example. These are 3 shows that launched in Spain in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Now, on the left side of this chart, you can see the linear ratings. So you can see linearly, these shows did okay, that there was initial interest. The promo team and marketing team did a good job of getting people to tune in, but there's no real indicator here of which show is going to become a global phenomenon and which shows maybe not so much. And that's when we add in our metric called demand, which is on the next slide. So when we add in our metric called demand, you can see that 2 shows, Catedral del Mar and Matadero, are kind of like, they're doing okay in the level of demand. But one show, Money Heist, is exponentially showing much higher demand. And that is because we can measure demand in all countries around the world, whether or not a show has been released legally yet. So we can see people talking about shows. We can see people researching shows. We can see people pirating shows. That is what demand can do. It can give you a leading indicator of success. And as we all know, Netflix picked up Money Heist and it became an absolute global smash. They're about to launch season 5. So we're about leading indicators. And the next one, please. So what else can demand do? Well, the other thing that demand do, it can help you forecast subscribers to a service. Now, this is the share of global demand for original programming on the networks you can see underneath there. So you can see Netflix has about a 55% share of audience attention in Q1 2020 for their original programming. That has been going down. Now, Netflix will say there's a pandemic on and, you know, subscriber numbers have been up and down, and we completely agree. But we also think that the competition is starting to heat up. You can see here, particularly with Disney, particularly with Apple TV, particularly with HBO Max, that the competition is starting to heat up. Now, if we go to the next slide and look at the Nordics, you can see even more interestingly, the one region where Netflix is maybe struggling a bit to maintain its domination is the Nordics. We're seeing about a 40% share of original programming for Netflix in Q2 2021. Look at that share for Disney. Since the Marvel machine kicked into gear, since legally Disney was available in the Nordics, you can see that share has increased massively. You can also see HBO with a good share of attention, even though the HBO Max platform has yet to come. And then you can see Apple TV, which is fast becoming a necessary service. Now, what's grey is other. So we don't cover every single program in the whole world. That would be very difficult, but we cover 17,500 of them. And we reckon about 10 or 11% of the audience share of attention for original programming in the Nordics is coming from local services. Thank you. Next slide. So our thesis is that we live in an attention economy. The fact that you're all sitting there giving me your attention for half an hour, I really appreciate, because your attention could be on so many different things. And it's the same in the television world. There are so many shows, there are so many platforms that really we don't know where we're standing when it comes to viewers. So we set out as Parrot Analytics to measure that attention economy, because we believe if you can measure it, you can answer the biggest questions that the industry has. And the next one, please. So very briefly, we capture about 2 billion people interacting with content online, whether they're downloading, sharing, microblogging, researching, or talking about TV. Next one, please. Let's bring this slide up. Then the second, we extract the signal from the noise. So if you like a show on Facebook, we'll capture that, but it's quite a passive impression. You haven't shown much interest in it. If you start subscribing to updates, deeply researching or actively consuming, we rate that higher and higher and higher because you're spending more time on a television show. And from that, we produce our numbers in all markets. So wherever there is an IP address around planet Earth, we can capture audience demand in about 100 different languages. So we can capture a show in many different languages. And most importantly, we're content centric, we're platform agnostic. So we can finally compare shows, say on Disney, to shows on Viaplay. Next slide, please. So let's look at the opportunity for Nordic content. Let's dig into this and see what our data is showing. We've done some exclusive analysis for you. Now, when we add up all our billions of signals around the world, the US makes up about a 10% share of all content demand. And you can see 5% in the UK and 4% in Canada. So when you space it out, it doesn't look that much from each country, but you've got to remember this adds up obviously to 100%. So if you're producing content just for the Nordic region, you're only reaching a very small part of the demand for television shows worldwide. So the opportunity for traveling content is massive. Next slide. So when you look at that and you break that down to the Nordics, you can see that the region that expresses the highest demand for content within your region is Sweden with 40%, which kind of makes sense. Then you see Norway with 24, Denmark with 16, and you can read this chart. So this is how the region breaks down. Next one, please. Now you can see here that Sweden represents 17% share of the global demand for Nordic produced content. Okay, so when you're talking Nordic produced content, you're talking 17%. Now next is Russia. And this is a really interesting fact that we keep finding out, is that Russia has a high demand for Nordic content. You can see Denmark there, you can see Norway there. You can have a copy of these slides afterwards so you can make your way through them. Next one, please. So when we look at that and we look at the regional demand for content on a genre level, we can see some key things. So you can see if we look at the worldwide demand on the left-hand side and then the Nordic demand on the left-hand side, the second column, looks fairly stable. But when we start to look and break it down with the individual countries, it's very different. So you can see drama is over-indexing in Iceland. And you can see there's a big over-index for reality in Iceland and Denmark. There's an over-index for comedy in Iceland, and Finland is into animation and kids shows. So my point is, the genre mix changes. The demand for genres changes even within the region that you're sat in today, and that's what we look at. Next slide, please. So we now look at the demand for Nordic produced content versus the global average. There's an extraordinary story that comes out here, probably the biggest story in the world of drama, is that Nordic content represents 65% of audience demand for Nordic produced content, which makes sense. So you've got a higher share. It's driven by a lack of productions from some other genres, and it's driven by the global success of a handful of titles. You can see the kids category there as well. So that's interesting, but now let's break it into subgenre. So subgenre, you can see here that all content, you can see there's a smorgasbord of subgenres that make up, say, 50%. But at the bottom, you can see that Nordic content is crime drama and it's thriller. And those two alone take up 43% of the demand for Nordic content. So what does that tell us? Next one, please. 43% of Nordic productions are crime drama and thriller. So it's a heavy over index. And you can see how heavy it is on the next slide. You can see crime, comedy drama and mystery drama are the other two to point out where Nordic content is really cutting through. You can see those over indexes there. And the next one. So this is fascinating here. What we found was that almost 52% was made up of those genres you can see there for the world. 13 subgenres made up 50% of all content demand, yeah, worldwide. In the Nordics, it's just 3. Yeah, crime, drama, thriller, and school. So given what the world is demanding, what we know the world is looking at when it comes to TV, there is opportunity here to come outside of the norm, to look outside of crime, drama, and thriller, because there is appetite for it around the world that is not being exploited, is what our data suggests. Thank you. So let's look at how market demand varies for Nordic content relative to the average and go country by country. So if you want to reveal this slide, please. So what you can see here is in the top left quadrant, you've got markets that over-index. So this is the increased share of demand for all content on the left-hand side and increased demand in Nordic content on the x-axis. So the ones you're seeing there are more westernized, but there is potential there. Given the right Nordic content offering, it's quite easy to move those into the next category, which is, sorry, I'll do this one down here. So markets, the ones in red down here are the markets that typically present a low share of demand for content in general, and they also under-index for Nordic original content. Those are the countries where you find it's going to be more difficult for Nordic content to cut through. And the next one. These are the over-indexing markets, but they generally have a lower overall average reach. So they index really well for Nordic content, but they're not reaching as many eyeballs. And finally, this is the green quadrant. This is a good quadrant. So markets that land in this space, our data suggests represent a very key potential growth opportunity for Nordic content. So obviously Sweden's there, you can see Russia, Spain's there, Belgium, Argentina, Ukraine, and the Germany and Netherlands. But this is a fascinating chart, and a lot of our clients use it. Next one, please. So what contributes to and makes a global hit? Like what makes a hit go global and what doesn't? Next one, please. So surely the answer is you just need to get it onto an international streamer, right? Well, no, it's not that simple, because you can see here when we place all our 17,000 shows in average, good, outstanding, and exceptional, that it takes a hell of a show to break through to exceptional. And some networks here have a lot of shows that sit in our average or below average category. So even though they're global, even though they're worldwide, they're not the hits that these networks want them to be. And it takes a hell of a show to break through. So you can see that bang for buck, you can see Disney, which should have a couple more purple dots in there for the Marvel series. You can see Stars, and you can see HBO. Their demand per dollar is higher. They're being more efficient in how they produce hits. Thank you. Because different shows lend themselves to individual demand mixes. So those that we see have much more demand worldwide tend to perform well across all our buckets. So you can see a Brooklyn Nine-Nine. You can see 35% piracy, 14% social video, 33% social media, and 18% research. That is a very well-rounded set of demand for Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is why it's such a global hit. You can see a couple of things. Chernobyl there has almost 60% research. We generally see that for shows that are based on real life. And Peppa Pig has 70% social video, and that's fairly self-explanatory given the access to that show. Thank you. What's really interesting is when you look at new IP. So this is The Queen's Gambit, which is a wonderful show that I'm sure you've all seen. Audiences discovered this in a total new way. So first of all, we saw people talk about it. You should watch that show about chess. Well, it's about chess. I don't really want to watch a show about chess. No, you really should watch it. So first of all, the conversation, then the research about the show. We saw millions of people join chess groups around the world, people wanting to understand were the characters within the show really real. So we saw research kick off, and then we saw massive amounts of consumption and piracy around the world. So when you're launching a show, it's very interesting to see how they launch differently to, say, existing IP, where we generally see a big consumption curve because people know what they're about to get. Thanks. So how do you assess a title's value to a platform? Well, we all know that platforms are about acquisition and they're about retention. And we have a very interesting way of looking at it here at Parrot. So what you're seeing here is catalogue overlap. So when we take our piracy data, we can see not only what shows an anonymous endpoint is watching, but we can also see what shows they watch next. Okay, so we have 400 million different anonymous endpoints where we can see what people are pirating. And we don't do that for enforcement, we do that to really help the industry understand. So the way to read this is that 10 out of 25 titles, 40% of the top 25 titles with the highest affinity to The Witcher were also on Netflix. That makes it a very high retention show. Those are the ones you want to put on your squeeze credit reels and tell your existing subscribers about. Apple, we saw about 4 out of 25 for the morning show. So you could argue Apple will be happy with that, given what their goals are. The interesting one was when The Mandalorian initially launched, we saw 0. So there was no other shows being consumed that were also on Disney Plus when The Mandalorian initially came out, because they were lacking maybe a bit of adult content. Thank you. Next one. So we looked at The Mandalorian and we looked at WandaVision, which seemed to have the same issue when it was launched in January, even though a wonderful show it was. But then it got better with The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. We suddenly saw 4 out of 25, 16%, which was much better. So what changed? Well, we'll see on the next slide. What changed was that they launched Star. Star was launched, and immediately we saw the retention rates for some shows pick up. So the Falcon's there, and if we reveal one more, you can see that Loki was actually higher still. It was on 5. So adding the adult content really started to drive people through the catalogue. And it's a key thing when it's all very well going niche and franchise and, it's concentrating on one genre. But when you add multiple genres, when you add multiple demographics, when you go broad, there's definitely more catalogue overlap on a service. So we analyze that. Thank you. We'll just skip over this one. So you can see that The Falcon, there were 4 shows suddenly. So you saw Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Family Guy started to come up as being catalogue overlap. Thank you. Next one. And we also saw it increase for The Mandalorian. And go again. And if you want to reveal this slide, there's 4 things to reveal on this slide. Essentially, what we do here is we map out content to uncover where it's most likely to hit objectives. So we can map retention against acquisition. And if we reveal 4 things on this slide, I'm so sorry my ticker's not working. Yeah, keep going. Let's do the 4 of them. Beautiful. So you can see here that the titles in red on the bottom left are titles which we see exhibit traits that present a higher risk of churn. Those are the titles that you're risking your viewers falling off your service if you see them watching this show, because there's not a lot of catalogue overlap. Now, the ones in the middle red box, the key retention drivers, those are the ones that are really driving people through your service. So if someone watches Westworld in this example, they're likely to keep watching shows on your service. So it's a good one to have on your retention strategy. Now, Rami has massive potential in reducing churn where we run this. Must be in the Middle East. So you can see that even though the demand is fairly low, it's really keeping people on the service. And you can see our old friend Game of Thrones at the top, which is maybe slightly less than average retention, but that's the one that you wanted to stick on your billboards and talk about. Those are the ones that you want to put outside Central Station in the Nordics. So that's how we map content out to what it's actually for. Thank you. Next slide. So let's quickly look at binge or weekly drop, because this is an interesting thing here. What are the latest data-driven facts that are showing us whether we should drop a show all at once or showing whether we should drop it weekly? Well, we mapped this all out for you because this is what we do. And we saw that 2019 was a turning point for streamers moving away from the binge model. This was the first time you can see binge in the blue and you can see weekly in the orange. So this was the first time that demand for weekly release originals exceeded the supply. Okay, so since then, the number of digital originals released on a weekly schedule has increased, and you can see that, but not as fast as demand for these shows has grown. So the audience is getting used to big shows being dropped in the way that I certainly remember them being dropped week by week. Now, the next slide really paints this out. This is Amazon experimenting with the release schedule of The Expanse, and it's fascinating. So what you can see here is the demand on the Y column, and on X you can see the weeks from the event start date. So each one of those squares is when the series was first dropped. So series 3, they dropped on linear. So you can see the linear spikes that we're all pretty familiar with in television, where people are viewing week by week, and then there's a decay curve. Then you see that they experimented season 4 by going binge. So you can see that initial binge that I was talking about earlier, where people just want to watch the show, get all the way through it because they love it. And then you can see what we call a decay curve after that, with people finishing the show and moving on to the next great thing. Now, what they did with season 5 was they dropped it weekly. So you can see that it was initially a huge success. They got people tuning in, and then there was generally more demand. And you can see on a week by week level, they really built the interest and kept people talking about the show all the way to that big finale, when we started to see decay after that. So take away from that what you will, but it's fascinating, the difference that we're seeing between release schedules, and it's very key that you really think carefully about what you're trying to achieve with your show when you release it. Is it something that's going to generate massive conversation? If so, maybe drop it on a week by week basis. Next one, please. So does demand for binge decay more quickly? Well, this is the decay curves for binge all throughout the world, every single show that we look at in 2019, 2020, 2021. Now, 2019 and 2021 were fairly standard. Of course, we all know 2020, what happened. But you can see that the demand for binge releases seems kind of fairly stable there. But the next slide is where the key is. What we have found is that binge releases now have a much shorter half-life. Okay, so 2020, again, a complete aberration in data due to the C word, which I'm not going to mention in this presentation. But you can also see that in 2019 there was a half-life, but the half-life in 21 has gone down again. Now that is because people are finding much more things to watch much more quickly, and they're jumping around between platforms and they're going from show to show. Remember in the days where we all tried to get people to tune into our channels with our channel ID spots and making channels look absolutely amazing, when all people wanted to do is watch a single show. So it's the same thing here, but we're seeing that appetite for shows is growing and growing, but people are becoming more flippant in how they power through these shows and then move on to the next thing. Thank you. So let's look at 5 takeaways. I've taken up too much of your time already. So 5 takeaways. The strategy of locally produced tentpole programming in the Nordics and the commissioning schedule is working. There's no doubt about it. You're getting share of demand, particularly in the original space, and it's driving some services. Beware the newcomers. They have some pretty serious guns. They're all starting to build local shows, as you know, and we can see from our global charts that when they launch, they do take attention. So beware of them. When commissioning, our data suggests, as you can see, that there is demand for genres other than crime, drama, and thriller from the Nordics. And I know that may be controversial, but I'm just here to report what our data tells us. You can use catalogue overlap and local demand to really work out what a piece of content can do in each region. One piece of content is not the same as another piece of content. Is this meant to acquire? Is it meant to retain? Is it meant to drive conversation? Choosing release schedule carefully based on what you're trying to achieve on your audience engagement objectives is, we think, one of the key topics in the industry, and will becoming more key as people try and figure out how they keep people on their services. And be aware of the genres and subgenres that are in demand around the world when you're prioritizing your international sales by market. And if we just jump to the final slide, my final word is that great stories will always travel. You produce a great story, the world will watch it. And please keep producing amazing stories from the Nordics. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. There was certainly a lot of data here, and there was a lot of details also that might be a little difficult to read for our audience in the screen here. But thank you for sharing all this data with us and also sharing the PDF file where you will be able to go deep into all the data that Steve has presented here. And is it true to say that the data that you have here today, they are completely fresh, but what you say is that they are changing over time, so that is your main product to follow and track all this different kind of going up and going down for the different kind of data that you are tracking?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I mean, we have harvesters all over the world who are constantly finding new shows that are being commissioned and produced, and we start to onboard them onto our database. So as soon as they're onboarded, we can start seeing them being demanded around the world. So it is an absolutely fascinating space to be sitting in to understand how trends and how people are viewing all the way around the world and what that means for the business that we all love.
And just a final small question for you. Could you just say a little bit more about how you actually track the data? I noticed that you also mentioned piracy, so you are actually having millions of different sources out there that you use to put together your audience demand data sets.
Yeah, sure. So we have 4 buckets. The first one is social media. So whenever someone talks about your favorite show on social media, talks about a hashtag, talks about a character within a show, we've got a lot of machine learning that scrapes through the internet looking at that. The second is research. So whenever you jump on Wikipedia or a TV maze or you look up a TV show, deeply researching a TV show is key to engagement. So we look at research as a second bucket. The third bucket we look at is social video. So we look at the YouTubes, the Vimeos, the Daily Motions of the world, and we really understand what people are viewing, whether it's trailers, whether it's character profiles, whether they're talking about a show on social video. And finally, and probably most key, we look at consumption, which is what the industry calls piracy, not for enforcement, but because when you understand more about why people pirate content, it can help you with monetization, and it can help you with release schedules. Like, for example, we saw a show that was produced in BBC America and the BBC in London that was only in those 2 countries. We saw about 35% piracy for that show when it was released day and date in those 2 countries. We saw 75% piracy for that show in the rest of Europe. So you can argue that that is a missed monetization opportunity by not going day and date. And I think, obviously the windows are being collapsed, but we need to think carefully about, there is still piracy, but how can we use that information to understand how we can make more money and how bring more audience?
Thank you, Steve. Very interesting. Lots of data. And thank you for joining us here in Copenhagen.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.